they are mercenaries and they are money motivated. I think it's slightly more complicated than that, although Prigozhin's loyalties have been questioned in the past, and there were suggestions in recent weeks that he'd been in touch with Ukrainian military intelligence. Now, the details of those conversations have never been made public. They've never been officially avowed by the Ukrainian government. Well, I mean, it remains this stunning surprise that Vladimir Putin's once loyal acolyte, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and his Wagner Group mercenaries have launched this sort of armed uprising and insurrection principally against the Russian armed forces, but inevitably simultaneously against Vladimir Putin and his regime. This began last night, ostensibly, Prigozhin said, because he claimed one of his bases had been struck by a Russian missile and a number of his guns for hire killed. But clearly, many analysts have pointed out today that the speed and scale of his response suggests that this has been planned for some time. He claims his troops took the city of Rostov-on-Don, home to about 1 million people, without hardly a shot fired. We've also seen Russian military helicopters in action and fast jets in action in the nearby city of Voronezh, where, again, Prigozhin claims his forces have captured all the Russian military installations, and they're now attempting to move further north towards the capital, Moscow.
And, where do you think this has been coming from? I mean, Prigozhin has made sort of overtures that he's been very angry with the military in Russia. What's your sense of when this sort of began in his mind and what his motives are?
Well, there has been a very bitter public and long-running feud between Prigozhin and the Russian military establishment, which is embodied by the defense minister Sergei Shoigu and the chief of the general staff, Admiral Valery Gerasimov. Prigozhin has claimed that the Russian Ministry of Defense has deliberately starved his forces of ammunition, particularly artillery shells, while his forces were involved in a long and very bloody fight for the town of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, which for many, many months was the epicenter of the war and cost many, many thousands of lives on both sides. He's also accused the general repeatedly of incompetence and corruption. I mean, that incompetence has been exemplified by many of Russia's defeats over the course of nearly the course of the last year and a half since Russia invaded Ukraine. Prigozhin has repeatedly sort of pointed to failures of the Russian army to make advances, failure to secure advances once they've made them. Indeed, when his forces handed over positions in and around Bakhmut to regular Russian forces, he was immediately critical of the way they handled them, and indeed, when they were forced to retreat, he was furious, pointing out that his men had taken months and lost many, many lives to capture territory that was quickly ceded back to the Ukrainians.
And a question we've just had from one of our listeners, Jerome Nigel's just messaged in saying, as they are a well-known mercenary group and they work for the highest wage, could the West now offer them a higher price for their service and get them to switch sides?
Well, Nigel, I mean, it's a very interesting idea. Certainly they are mercenaries and they are money motivated. I think it's slightly more complicated than that, although Prigozhin's loyalties have been questioned in the past, and there were suggestions in recent weeks that he'd been in touch with Ukrainian military intelligence. Now, the details of those conversations have never been made public. They've never been officially avowed by the Ukrainian government. On one level, we know that Wagner forces, of course, were in contact with Ukrainian forces in and around Bakhmut, partly because of things like prisoner swaps and opportunities to return dead bodies from one side to the other. These kind of low-level unofficial contacts often exist in war. It would not surprise me if there have been attempts to try and buy off elements of the Wagner Group, up to and including possibly Prigozhin himself. I have no evidence, though, to suggest that's the case. It would not surprise me if there had been similar efforts to try and buy off elements within the Russian army as well.
And just one final question very quickly, Jerome. I mean, what do you think the Wagner Group's chances are? What are their numbers compared to the numbers of the Russian military force? I mean, it's probably much smaller. I mean, what do you think their chances are of of winning this if it does come to some sort of almighty sort of battle?
Well, if it comes to a set-piece battle, then their chances aren't good. Their best chance is speed and agility. And whilst they might not necessarily have surprise anymore because we're all talking about this and Moscow, we know, is preparing to defend itself, nonetheless, what we've seen over the last year and a half of the war in Ukraine is that the Russian army suffers from staggering inertia and not particularly good or dynamic leadership. The suggestion is, I think, that the Wagner Group may have something between 150 or 400 vehicles heading north towards Moscow at the moment. Those are just unconfirmed reports coming out of Russia. It really depends what they meet, and then crucially, it depends what resistance is offered. I mean, so far, there hasn't been a lot of significant resistance to this advance. Now, that exactly why is not clear, but it may well be that Prigozhin's message that ordinary Russian soldiers have been betrayed by idiot generals who've sent them to the slaughter is resonating among these regiments, many of which have been decimated over the last year and a half in the war in Ukraine.